Hi, yes, I'm Kenley Bradstreet, the head of brand partnerships at Quizlet, which, show of hands, anybody who knows about Quizlet? Nice, nice. If you don't know, it's a huge platform beloved by Gen Z on a mission to help everyone everywhere learn, and brands keep that learning free. And this is a fun mix because a lot of the data at hand here concerns the life and times of folks who are on Quizlet, Gen Z, but also everybody. And yeah, as it's data from a different perspective, it's a little bit about music and entertainment and brands. Jordy, you spoke earlier, but please reintroduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
I'll keep it super brief, not to bore you. Jordy Freak here. I'm with Sony Corp of America. I'm leading brand and business development for our audio business. It's consumer audio, professional audio. A lot of work with talent, a lot of work with emerging technology, and great to be back here.
Excellent. And Mo, tell us a little bit about the Advisory Council.
Yeah, so the Advisory Collective, it's
Collective, sorry.
That's great. So this was really actually born out of seeing this need where there's a lot of intersectionality that is coming together, right? So people are not staying in silo. Fans don't exist in silo. It's not just there's music or movies or TV. People are people. They're multidimensional. They like a lot of different things. And so when you see the way that fandom is being treated, you also see emerging technology. It's really about living and existing at that intersection and helping brands and businesses actually build for the future. So that's really what I'm focused on now on a broader scope. And so previously I was at IMAX and then Paramount and Google before that. So really have been living at that intersection of technology and brands and entertainment.
And data. So could you kind of, I think both maybe together, share the story of the partnership between Sony and the Advisory Collective? Yes, I can start there.
Yeah. So this actually, this really started in a really organic way around, Sony and Jordy and what they're doing really to be sort of pioneers in this space and really thinking about what does brand building look like? How do you think about investment into entertainment differently? How do you think about that in a more novel way? How do you think about that in a more sustainable way from long-term strategy and what goes into long-term strategy? And this will get to the conversation around data, which is one of my favorite topics, because I think it's persistent, but it's constantly changing. And I think that one of the biggest things is how do you get your point of view around data to like what I call the one smooth pebble. Data is such a huge, huge topic that it can be everything. And when something is everything, it also can be nothing, right? So it's really drilling down into like, what is the specific thing that you're looking for? Are there the right data sets that are completely conclusive? If they're not conclusive, what are the missing pieces to that? How do you account for that? How do you plan for that? And again, it's all about long-term perspective, right? What is the sustainability of the strategy? So that's really how we started to work together, and we've grown the relationship. And one of the areas that we really invested in from a data perspective is drilling into that, right? What are the insights you actually want? Again, you can have trillions and trillions of data points and have zero insights. Okay? And that can be a really frustrating endeavor. And so through that, we started working with a company called Luminate. And we'll talk a little bit more about what they did. But also, it's not just about the data. It's not about the what. It's the why. What are you trying to achieve out of it? Why are you wanting a certain data set? What are those KPIs? And are those two things actually well matched?
Yeah, okay, so you introduced the idea of Luminate, and maybe, Jordy, do you want to explain?
I actually had a question.
Great.
How many folks in the room are actually investing in music for brand marketing? Okay, a little bit. What about, I know there's some folks filming TV, ton of people filming TV, yes, no, like entertainment IP, some, okay. How many people have been thinking about music, entertainment? Okay, more hands. So, Luminate is an interesting company that we came across recently through Mo. Just in short summary, they are the official kind of data aggregator for the Billboard charts in music. I think they were Nielsen before, Nielsen Music, and then they spun out and they're owned by Penske Media that owns Variety, Hollywood Reporter, and Rolling Stone. And what's interesting about Luminate is they basically have the rights to all of the data from all the streaming companies in music to pass through on a daily basis and get broken down by region, demographic, you name it, anyone on the streaming platforms. And for us as a brand that, as you know from kind of some of the signage, what we've talked about, we're very interested in music. From an audio brand standpoint, when we're thinking about talent, when we're thinking about investment in music, we actually need a deeper level of data set than was available to us. So, traditional brand marketers would be looking at social data to choose talent. Maybe you go on Spotify, you look at, okay, there are 50 million monthly listeners for a particular artist, 20 million monthly listeners. That really doesn't tell me anything at all in terms of the audience and how it correlates to our business, especially when there are musicians who, their core offering in the world, first and foremost, beyond their celebrity, is their music, and then that music's used with our product. So we needed to understand, how many of these listeners on different platforms are actually paid listeners versus free listeners. We wanted to understand, a little bit deeper on some of the demographics of the listenership. We wanted to understand the geographic nature, considering we're a global brand. And we also wanted to understand, too, when we do certain activities, how is there an impact on kind of the core talent's activity? So let's say you activate in a market, sure, you want to hit your KPIs, but if you're trying to come out with a little bit of competitive advantage when you're doing your next deal, what can you actually say that drove more value for the partner? And if you can quantify that in, hey, we drove 200% more streams in the market benchmark year over year prior, that's a pretty powerful tool. So that's where Mo came in, introduced us to Luminate, and we're the first brand client. So.
Okay, and I'll get to we'll get to an example in a second, but Mo, can you explain just a little bit more about what the index is, what it's taking into account, and how people are using that data?
Yeah. No, so the best way I guess I could explain Luminate, right? And Luminate is actually a 30-year-old company. It's an amalgamation of, it's a rebrand of multiple different companies that a lot of people here have probably heard of. Nielsen Music, for example, being one of them. The best way to think about it is it's really the only truly one-on-one consumption data out there that's in aggregate, right? And so when you talk about data, you want to understand like how robust is that data, how clean is that data, how complete is that data set, and is it a data set that I care about, right? So that was one of the things. And so when Jordy said, we're making a big concerted effort around music, we're building out a whole strategy, we started looking and saying, okay, who has a data set that's actually really complete and really in-depth and goes into the level of detail that they're looking for. And so that's where we started to look at Luminate. So when you think about what Luminate does, it's really a platform that has a one-on-one data set that has the total aggregate across every major music DSP, and it's all consumption data. It's not extrapolation of, it's not saying, hey, we think that this will be the trend. They are seeing the actual trends there. And if you think about a stream is, a fan raising their hand saying, look at me. This is what I want. This is what I'm interested in. So it's really incredibly robust and conclusive data that goes really in depth. And then on top of that, it's looking at, well, how far reaching is that? What are the other implications of it? So when you look at what Luminate does, it has a true sort of one-of-one data set that, by the way, has been used by entertainment insiders for 30 years, right? It's what powers the Billboard chart. So everyone on the entertainment side has been utilizing this data. And now they're making that exact data set available and accessible for the first time to brands. So it actually now is creating better conversations between brands and artists and people on the entertainment side, because now you have a commonality of language. Right now you actually can talk about the same things in the same metrics and in the same dimension. So you're really taking what has been considered sort of the entertainment insider track, and now you're giving more access to it. And so from a brand perspective, if you're investing into entertainment, you now have this edge, right? So now you understand where you can kind of put the pulse on, what's not only happening right now, where it's happening, but what's coming, right? We talk a lot about this, but culture is actually happening below the line, right? Culture is not when it hits the front page of a magazine. Culture is when fans start to aggregate together. They say, I love this, I want more of this, I want to connect with other people who love the same thing. And so that's something, for example, that Luminate knew that regional Mexican was going to be the next big thing 18 months out. Right? And those are the types of things that we started to discuss. So that's the best way to just talk about why we started to make that partnership come to life.
Okay. So, as an example, recent spot for Sony for the Link Buds with Olivia Rodrigo, featuring her music. Not rolling it right now, but just imagine that it is great. It is a really excellent spot.
Thank you.
It's compelling and it's blending technology and artistry. And
By the way, it was driven by her, actually.
Really?
Yeah, she came to us. Sorry, we don't have the clip. Just the premise of it, you could Google it. She's in the subway, pops in her Link Buds, sees someone that drops something. I think another pair of Link Buds, and she's chasing this person. She's getting a phone call, blah, 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 and then she gets out of the subway and finds her person, and it's her doppelganger, basically. So she wanted to do that. She loves New York. We have an activation coming up. We're all over MTA of the past month or so, yeah.
yeah, it actually was really well done in that it was her music, but it also was very product focused, and she went through all of the features and benefits and everything in the spot. Nicely done. But I believe that spot was put together before you launched the partnership with Luminate. But I think the question is how would Luminate influence the decision, to partner in the first place, and then maybe does it have a role to play now?
I'll actually backtrack it,
Okay.
or reverse it. I'll start from the end and work backwards. So, couple examples. I mentioned we have an activation coming up in New York. We're going to be making noise. We have MTA. She released an album last year, so it's been out in the market for some time. Tours over. How does that activity actually impact her streams? So that's one of her core businesses. If we're really one of the only things going on with her at that particular time, and it's in a particular geographic location in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at the data to determine, okay, well, how much noise did we make? How much spike in streams relative to the maybe 28-day or 60-day average was there? And there's nothing else in the market, so you could attribute it to our activity. And then for the next collaboration with whomever we do, we could actually point to it and say, well, for this collaboration, we did X event, and it led to incremental streams on this day, so it has tangible value. Obviously, that's a single day, but then if you advertise, or if you take that and apply it across a tour, then it has some tangible implications. And of course, you need to go a little bit deeper to determine attribution, right? But the principle is clear. I'd say another component too, again, there's obviously the selection side, which I talked about to an extent. We're relying very heavily on freemium versus premium, knowing that there was one artist, I've used this example, that we were looking at who's a really, really big artist who's going to be in, I'm not going to mention any names, but it's going to be in a very popular show. And we looked at their data, and we thought this artist was going to be great, but then we realized 25% of their listenership was in a single secondary market in APAC with 80% free users. So that we're leaving a lot on the table there if we went with that artist in terms of the value of the listenership relative to our KPIs and our goals. So we can't do. But that's another example. And then the last thing I'd say too, back to the competitive edge that you mentioned, there's a lot of power in the knowledge beforehand going into a negotiation. You can look ahead of time and say, hey, X artist, there's some growth in a secondary market, say Japan, right? The data shows that there's a little bit of a trend, but it's not fully there. And you can go into a negotiation and say, hey, we see some growth in Japan. is that of interest to you? And, they say, yeah, okay. And we can say, okay, let's double down on this market because there's strategic value to you, and that gives us more leverage.
Well, you end up doing things like what we've been doing with Sony is also like almost coming up with your own sort of data metric or the signal that you're looking for. So one of the signals that we look for is velocity, right? And we have a calculation now where you can use this raw data, right? And you can do that with a compilation of data. You can look at different data layers together, and you're getting an aggregate picture of what, a metric that we call velocity, right? We have a calculation of this is the velocity score that we're looking at, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to get ahead of the trend, right? So there may be a time and a place where you want to be very much on trend, and this has massive scale and massive awareness, but that will shape the strategy, it'll shape the execution, it'll shape what you actually intend to get out of that. Versus you may also look at things like the velocity score, saying, hey, the total awareness, right, may be a little bit lower, but the velocity is there, right? Everything indicates that this is very much in hyper growth, and this is going to be taking on traction. So either seeding the relationship and seeding the conversations for a future, or also in aggregate, right, choosing a collection of artists that have very high velocity, and then that can inform a different type of execution of what you're looking at. So I think the overall thing is that when you talk about Olivia happened sort of after this partnership, but really it's not necessarily linear. And this is like the biggest thing I try to impress on everyone. It is cyclical. You have to it's not just A to B and then you're done and you have to go back to A. That's exactly what you're trying to avoid, because it's what I call the learning tax, right? There's always a tax you pay. There's some amount of inefficiency in anything that you do. But if you pay the same tax every single time, you're not getting better and better and better, then that becomes a compounding problem for you, right? So the way that we look at it is it's really a cycle. So how do we have this be, the flywheel, the cycle? How do we get better and better so that from planning to execution to measurement, you're going back and you're using that to then inform the next set of planning, the next execution, the next measurement, and then you keep on rinse and repeat. And the goal is basically that learning tax, the inefficiencies that you have, you're shrinking that inefficiency over time because you're getting better and better about looking for the signals that matter to you and to your company and sort of your objectives, and also being able to find those signals out in the data world.
Yeah, and because as a brand, you would be very happy if you were partnered with Charlie XCX over the summer, and we all had a bright summer, we had an amazing time, that's so cool, but the question is, knowing that Charlie XCX, who's been awesome for a long time, was about to pop 18 months ago, so that you were already in place, right, to take advantage.
And seeing that also, and that was something that we saw. We saw like there's this emergence of hyperpop, right? And it's already broken through now with Charlie XCX. Chaperone is a really good example, right? Chaperone has been around for a long time, and actually when you go back and you look at sort of that velocity measure, you can see the signals there. And that's one of the things too, is that you always can go also lean back in time. So it's not, don't just take it as, oh, well, I hadn't started, so, I'm like, I missed the boat. You can actually go and have hindsight, right? So go back and say, well, if we use this velocity metric, right, this calculation that we have, let's go back in time and see what was the score that XYZ artists that we know have definitively come through the surface, what was their score? So then you start to get a band of, okay, well then in the future, any artists that go above this threshold, we have a pretty good sense that they're probably going to pop within this time frame.
Oh, could I add to that? There's also an element of that we're looking at kind of negative confirmation bias. So like, you might think just qualitatively, being on social culture or what have you, oh, this is past the peak.
Yep.
But then if you look at the data, well, actually, there's a lot more give there in terms of room for it to expand, and you're challenging your kind of confirmation bias.
Yeah, or that fatigue, that like, oh, well, I'm too late, so I'm just going to move on
to
something else.
But the data can affirm whether or not, that's actually valid.
Yep.
And we actually look at that in terms of, we have these debates all the time, like, is it too late to get in with this artist? Have they peaked? Are we just followers at this point? And there could be an element, like, it is mutually exclusive to an extent. There could be, like, perception is perception, right? People will think what they think, but the data is still the data. And I think the data does represent the masses, and we ultimately need to market to the masses unless we're looking at like a hyper niche campaign.
Right. And yeah, generally I think if an artist has a really huge fandom, then that fandom will be excited to see them in more places, even if they already know about them. Although, I have a feeling there aren't going to be a ton of great partnerships in the near future. Just a little bit on some surprising data from Luminate, artists that you might not expect have a lot of impact.
Yeah. So I was talking about hyperpop, right? So they saw regional Mexican before it all completely blew up. Hyperpop is something that they've been talking about for a long time. J-pop is another category that they've been talking about, saying this is right around the corner, and you're starting to see that come through.
So K-pop, still cool, but
K-pop still cool. I'm Korean, so K-pop's still very cool. But J-pop is.
I mean, we just did the Seraphim.
Exactly. And then here's like one that was surprising to me, and it's not surprising because it's not that I don't believe she should be in the top 10, I absolutely do. But when you actually look at this Luminate index, which is interesting because it's looking at multiple dimensions, right? So you start with like what I call the seed of data. How clean is that seed of data and how robust is it, right? So they have, 100% sort of a sense of consumption. That's great. They have all sorts of other data points that you can start to layer in together. Some that are, by the way, free and accessible, but when you put everything in aggregate, you now start to see a different picture. So one of the things that they did on the Luminate Index is that they looked at multiple dimensions. They put it all together and they said, what are the top 10 artists? And they actually went 250 artists deep that have the biggest influence, especially from a brand perspective. They looked at multiple factors of that, not only just awareness, consumption, but also brand and product affinities, et cetera, and influence scores. And one of the top 10 is Dolly Parton.
Woo!
I saw the list, by the way. I think she's a legend, an icon, absolutely deserves to be, of course, in the top 10. Would that have been the first name that I would have thought of? No, to be quite frank. And again, that's a bias because also we're humans, right? We're not big AI bots yet. And so we're not looking at data points in that way. So that's why you want to look at that and say, again, it's always going to be gut and experience and the art of it, but also there's the science to it. So that was one where we said, okay, this is interesting. And then you cut it a different way. That's for general population. Then if you want to cut it and say, well, I want to see people who over-index for Gen Z or millennial. The list changes, right? Because there are people who over-index for certain audiences versus others. So those are just ways that you can start to think about and use it. And so when we saw Dolly Parton, we said, okay, well, we had a conversation. We're like, all right, is there something to do with Dolly Parton? She's in the top 10 on this list. And again, when you actually dig deeper and you look at all the metrics, you're like, actually, that makes a lot of sense. Is there something that we want to look at there? So it spurs really interesting conversations.
Nice. Okay, so outside of Luminate Index, obviously, amazing, hugely important. Are there other interesting data streams that you're using? Or is there some data that you're dying to get your hands on?
Yeah, so obviously music's a huge component for us and Luminate, but they also have a film and TV index too that kind of shares. And Mo, you could talk a little bit about this. We're not using it as much. There are elements that we're using, more and more when we're looking at music, times film, TV in terms of pop culture and IP, again, it comes back to challenging our biases. And when we're considering creative, we actually do find ourselves gut checking some of that data. Again, like for our day-to-day, not as much. But that's definitely an aspect. And then I'd say, like more broadly, when we kicked off this partnership with Mo and Rob Jonas, the CEO of Luminate, the opportunity presented itself to actually build. So sure, there's a core data that we have in front of us in the dashboard, whether it's film, TV, or music, but how do you almost white label to an extent, net new capabilities of, ways for us to work, ways for us to track attribution, ways for us to see the correlation across different data sets, and we're looking at that right now.
Yeah, and all the way to attribution and sale of who is the most product revenue moving.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that the goal?
Right.
Yeah. Well, and so I think what you get to is, so again, it's what I was saying at the beginning. I think that you're going to start to see things intersect a lot more. It's not just looking at just music, looking things in silos, not just film, TV, etc. You're starting to look at things holistically. Where is overall consumption happening? And who are the providers that can help you understand where consumption is happening? The second piece is where are transactions happening, and there are different players that bring in sort of the transaction piece. And then where is evangelism happening, right? And look, those are all going to intersect. But that's really what the secret sauce is, right? You want to look at where's the consumption, where's time being spent, where are transactions happening, and how do those two things overlap? And then also, where does evangelism and loyalty sit? So are people not only consuming, they're transacting, are they sharing? Can you actually create that behavior, right? So what we talk about a lot is, one, understand what behavior you want to know. What's the behavior you want to incentivize, right? Which can be born from first understanding it. What do you want to incentivize? And then what are you willing to give to get to that behavior point, right? And when you match that all together, now you actually have a better picture of, one, your KPIs, and then two, how you actually want to deploy the data and then measure it and see, again, rinse and repeat, get better and better as you go.
Okay, I love it. Jordy, do you have a piece of advice for the brand marketers in the room about, using data, basically?
Just look past social.
Yeah.
Social's great. It's important to find it, but it's a baseline. Depending on what you're looking at in terms of your area of interest, for your brand, for IP that you're trying to correlate with. There's just a lot more out there that we're trying to look at. Again, we're not perfect by any means, and we're focused on this one music piece. I'm sure there's so much more we could be looking at, well beyond music data, and we are in some other areas, but just expand horizons. I mean, we're trying to do that from the brand side, and it can be challenging. It requires education internally, but there's just a lot more out there.
Awesome. And any prediction? Last week when I was at another brand Innovators in New York, and there was a gentleman working on the Super Bowl halftime show entertainment. And he was talking about how to select that talent and special guests and how to reach new audiences and connect. So Kendrick Lamar will be halftime performer. Any call on special guests that you think will be making an impact? Might be hard.
I mean, there's the wish of who we'd like to see.
Sure.
I'm not going to share mine.
I don't know if I have speculation about who would be. I don't have speculation as to definitively who would be. I think what everybody is probably on top of everyone's mind is there going to be Kendrick and Drake? That
was my wish list.
Yeah, I think everyone is, because there's obviously an incredible cultural thing happened, this year that we're still seeing, and so even though I don't have any predictions, that is actually not based on any crystal ball.
What are the odds?
Or any data.
What do you think the odds?
I don't know what the benchmark is say on that, but
I'm sure there's odds out there.
I'm sure. Yeah. I'm sure there
are. Okay, well, we'll see what happens, and maybe place bets. Do we have time for questions, or are we all?
We can do one question if someone's got one. Okay. All right.
We're all good?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Give it up, guys.